by whilst we are busy waiting for them to
Stand by, huh?
Thank you.
Yeah, stand by, huh?
Contel Marek 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Thank you for joining us on our QTV Business and Economy program. The Business and Economy program is intended to promote the ideals of a corporate Gambia identity with the objective of forging partnerships between the public and the private sector, civil society organizations, and the international community. It is that time of the year during which time the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs would submit to Parliament the budget for the upcoming fiscal year. This exercise has been undertaken, and today we have invited two distinguished personalities from the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs. We have invited the Permanent Secretary, Mr. Mort Cisse, at the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, and the Director of Budget, Mr. Baimade Cisse. Gentlemen, welcome to the both of you on the Business and Economy program.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you, and it's a pleasure for you to honor our invitation.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, we know that this time of the year your ministry is busy putting together the most important document that would guide how government receives its revenue and how government equally spends its revenue for the upcoming year. And perhaps by way of introduction, I would turn to you, the Budget Director. If I may ask, because I understand that you are the one that, collates everything, of course, with the direction of the Permanent Secretary and the Ministry, with assistance from the staff that would be within the Ministry. Could you give us a rundown, if you will, of the 2019 budget? But if you could help us and put it into perspective vis-a-vis 2018, but on key fundamentals. What is the main thing? What are the main things in the 2019 budget that you want us to appreciate as private sector and businesses in the economy?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mr. Roberts, for having us. Let me start with giving you an overview of the entire budget. If you look at the 2019 budget, we're looking at a budget of about 25 billion in terms of revenues. In terms of expenditure, we're looking at around 28 billion. For the revenue component, the bulk of it is coming from tax revenues, about 10.8 billion. Also, you have budget support, about 3.4 billion. Then you have non-tax revenue, about $1 billion. And you also have project grants, about 9.9 billion. For the tax revenue, domestic taxes, the bulk of it is coming from corporate tax, which is about 1.2 billion, moving from about 1 billion this year. You also have VAT going to 1.24 billion, going from 1.2 billion in 2018. And you also have the personal income tax as well, going from 718 million to about 990 million dollars. With regards to customs, the bulk of it is coming from import duty non-oil, going from 1.4 billion in 2018 to 1.9 billion in 2019. And you also have the import VAT non-oil items going from about 900 million to 1.2 billion. And you also have the import VAT on all items, that one is going from about 700 million to $1 billion. In terms of non-tax revenue also, we are expecting about from 900 million to 1 billion. The main reason is because government has revised a lot of its user fees and charges from 2018 to 2019. And we're expecting a significant growth in revenue, mainly because we expect more buoyancy into the economy. We also expect more imports coming into the country as well, and also more disposable income from the perspective of the civil servant. Also, because we're increasing our salaries by 50%, so that means also more tax revenue in terms of personal income tax. In terms of the expenditure component, by the way, with regards to project grants, you're also expecting roughly 9.9 billion. About 4 billion is coming from the African Development Bank. 2 billion of that is going towards this Trans-Gambia Bridge project. We're also expecting about 2 billion from China with regards to this Basay Fatoto Koina Bridge project. We're also expecting about 350 million from the Green Climate Fund, going towards this EBA project, which is the Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Project. We're also expecting about 567 million from France, mainly as budget support, 5 million euro. We're also expecting them to invest in the agriculture sector and also in the water sector as well too, and energy sector as well. In terms of expenditure, the total expenditure is looking about $28 billion. Let me first start with debt service. Total debt service will be about $4.8 billion going into 2019. You have about 2.3 billion going into domestic debt interest payment, which is mainly pertaining to the treasury bills and also the medium-term bonds. You also have about 400 million as external interest payment. So collectively, interest payments alone, we're spending about $2.7 billion. In terms of external amortization, we're budgeting about 1.5 billion and another 600 million for domestic amortization. So total, the debt service budget is about $4.8 billion. With regards to personal emolument, also is moving from 2.8 billion in 2018, going into 4.1 billion in 2019. The main reason is because we this 50% increment in the basic salary across the board for all civil servants. With regards to other current charges, that one is going from 5 billion to 6 billion in 2019. And for capital development, we're looking at from 900 million to $1 billion for capital development. So in a nutshell, this is an overview of the budget in terms of the numbers. But if you want me to go into the details as far as the our programs and outputs and the like, then maybe I will get into that later as well.
Well, thank you for that overview. I think time would not permit us to delve into the nitty-gritties. But you've given us quite a impressive overview in terms of the numbers that we're looking at. 25 billion vis-a-vis, I think, 19 billion previously in 2018. And of course, the budget support as well. But let me just touch on one point that you made in terms of the budget. When you looked at the reasons why we are seeing an increase in terms of revenues. I mean, as what is budgeted. You spoke of the buoyancy of the economy. You spoke of debates regarding imports, disposable income, given the size. Perhaps, more people coming back into the labor force, and also the increase in salaries and the PIN, the personal income tax, that people would ultimately be paying. The bit I want to talk on, or perhaps take you on, is the bit regarding the indirect taxes. Moving from 0.9 billion, 900 million, to it contributing about 1.1 billion, right as a result of revision of user fees. It seems as if we still continue on this trend in terms of direct taxation being the key contributor to overall revenues. Are we likely to see, not perhaps in 2019, but going forward, where perhaps indirect taxes would begin to be more meaningful in terms of their contribution to revenue streams for government?
Okay. Well, you want to go, or you want to continue?
No, I'll take you. Then after, since since you brought that point up, I'll take you, and then after I'll turn to, I'll come to more.
Yeah. If you look at the economy, it is mainly primarily dependent upon tax revenues. When you talk about tax revenues this year, we see a significant increment from about 8.6 billion to about 10.8 billion. And the fundamental question is, what are we really doing to attain this goal, about 20-something% increment on a year-to-year basis? Two things. The first thing is that we had undertaken a study with the IMF jointly. It's called the TADAT assessment, which is the Tax Administration Diagnostic Assessment Tool. And within this study, what we discovered is that we looked at different indicators. For example, we look at the integrity of the taxpayer registrar. We look at the efficiency in terms of risk management. We look at the timely filing of declarations, timely payment of taxes, accurate recording of your declarations, and the like. And in all these assessments, what we found is that there is room for improvement, basically. And then after that, we collectively worked with the IMF to come up with a program whereby we'll see how best we can improve the administration of taxes, of collecting taxes. And based on this, we believe that we can substantially increase the amount of revenues going towards tax revenue. In terms of non-tax revenue or indirect taxation, what we did was we looked at some of the user fees and charges that was being charged by government entities. For example, those being charged by the judiciary, those being charged by the Ministry of Justice, physical planning, lands and surveys. And most of these user fees have actually not been reviewed since 1977. So we said, given that the rate of inflation and also the new dynamics of the economy, maybe it's about time that we start reviewing these fees. So this is exactly what we did, and we have seen a big increment in terms of non-tax revenues as well, just because of the revision of these user fees and charges.
Okay. Piers, let me come to you. The caption of the 2019 budget read, Fiscal Consolidation, Restoring Macroeconomic Stability for a Prosperous Gambia. And if you look at the, not the cover page, but the front page, you have this graphical depiction. And on the last graph, there's a belt on the bar, indicating, as they would say, tighten your belt. And pretty much that dovetails very well with the caption, Fiscal Consolidation, Restoring Macroeconomic Stability for a Prosperous Gambia. I want to ask, and I want to get your perspective, how serious is government about managing its appetite for debt and addressing the fiscal imbalance inherent in our economy? He gave a brief rundown in terms of the compositions, the composition of the budget, the various, items. And I would pick on some of them in terms of the details as we go on. But general overview, you're an accounting officer, hold a very important role at the Ministry of Finance and hence the country. But in terms of fiscal consolidation, if I were to ask, how serious is government, on this?
So thank you, Ben. Allow me first to appreciate you inviting us to come and have a discussion with your viewership on this important subject of Budget 2019. But also to wish the audience watching tonight a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. We are quite happy to come here to talk to you for a very simple objective, because the budget usually signals a lot of things. It is a planning tool, but it's also a fiscal policy tool for which the government, and in particular the Ministry of Finance, relay some important messages to other stakeholders, like you said. Your program about business and economy is about bringing together cooperation between multiple stakeholders, the private sector, public sector, international community, and corporate entities to grow our economy. And one key stakeholder there is the public sector. Now, government, on the issue that you just asked, government is very serious about fiscal consolidation. Every message, every policy measure that we have highlighted in this particular budget, we mean it. Fiscal consolidation is simply the direction government must go to be able to enhance our economic recovery process and stabilization. We have no choice. The other thing is that some of the measures that we talked to you about related to some of the expenditure measures that we just introduced in the 2019 budget is nothing but basically to make sure that we also grow the non-tax sectors to be able to contribute to a situation where we are too dependent on taxes, like you said. And of course, dependent on taxes also means in future increased borrowing. Therefore, it is important that we have highlighted in the 2019 budget important public sector investments, transforming our SOEs to really continue to grow the wealth of this nation, and also reorient government revenue sources from what is at the moment a quite dependent tax-based economy to a non-tax-based economy. Now, fundamentally on the question of the debt you just asked, yes, it is true that would be quite soon to talk about weaning ourselves from debt. But to the extent that we would continue to borrow or we borrow for investment, debt is not necessarily bad. Because the concern relating to debt usually is that you are borrowing and transferring the borrowing to the future generation. But if you borrow and invest, then therefore it is equity, because you are borrowing to generate assets that will be there to also turn over wealth for the future generation. So the net effect would be that some of this investment will be self-financing by their nature, or they should not necessarily be a burden on the future generation. That is a very sensitive and very much understood dynamics. But I can tell you that we have seen so many countries use borrowed funds to transform their economy. In particular, China used to be a heavily indebted country, but today is the largest lender to the U.S. Treasury. We've seen also how U.S. have lent to then embattle or destroy Europe, which then later transform itself to becoming now today a lender to other countries. So to the extent that that is the case, we can assure you that we are using our fiscal tools, fiscal policy tools, to make sure that the risk posed as it relates to the direction of the future taxes is reduced as much as possible, and it will have minimal impact on the businesses if we are able to make that shift from tax-based dependent economy to non-tax-based dependent economy.
I know there's been a rebasing. I mean, I've not had the time to look at the details, but I know a rebasing was done. And even if you look at the 2019 budget, it speaks of old, GDP and, so, I mean, you've rebased using what, 2013? Okay, same practice as was undertaken by by GBOS. Yeah, looking at 2013, and that in itself has helped to bring the overall composition of domestic debt from over 50% to around 40%. Yeah, but the reason why I asked this question in terms of how serious is government in terms of tightening its belt is because if we look at the target that you've indicated, and if you look at paragraph 12 of 29 budget, it says the budget will continue to be anchored on limiting net domestic borrowing to 1.3% of GDP. But we know that as it is, we are talking about 40%, of GDP. So if you look at the variance is quite huge. Yes, I mean, that's stock, if you will, and you are looking at 2019 in its own right. And of course, if you're able to achieve this over time, year in, year out, it would help to bring that stock down. I mean, I mean, it's good that we bring these things out as well. But talking of realizing 1.3%, I mean, domestic borrowing, reducing it to 1.3% of GDP, which is in line with international standards. And you spoke of earlier in terms of the fact that there's going to be an across-the-board 50% increase in salaries. How does that impact on this target of fiscal consolidation?
Well, first on the rebasing, I mean, like my colleague just reminded you, an index that was way back in the 70s cannot be considered a proper reflective measure of current times. And hence, it is critical and important that the rebasing happened. The rebasing is nothing but literally basically looking at the parameters and sectors of our economy and see what is more significant in terms of contribution to the growth. The living standard of people and the living behavior of people have changed. To that extent, also, what is more important in the cost of living might have changed over time, and therefore the need to also modernize the index. So once you modernize the index, what came out quite clear was that, for example, if you look at agriculture, so many of the sectors that were not captured in the past is now included in the sector, in the basket. The structure of the economy overall, there were some significant sectors today, for example, the service sector, which now take center stage and contribute more to GDP. That recognition also have to be made in the index. So rebasing to reflect the reality is helpful, and that was exactly what had happened. The conclusion of the exercise was that the size of the economy was bigger than what we had always thought it was. So now, in terms of how that also then impact on some of the fiscal policy targets that we should, for example, in terms of deficit, in terms of revenue, in terms of expenditure, it is significant, because if you talk about 1.3 deficit in 2019 budget, it would be different from a 1% or 1.3 in 2018 budget, because the GDP numbers were different. However, it is significant because at the end of the day, you measure the capacity of the economy to sustain that. And therefore, we are saying that we are very conscious of this particular relationship between debt and the capacity of the economy. And in as much as possible, we need to control the burden of debt on the growth potential of the economy. In terms of fiscal consolidation, so many measures have been at play with regard to controlling debt. And one way of controlling debt, really, Mr. Ben, is to start with domestic reform. Our domestic economy have to be reformed such that we wouldn't be too much dependent on external investment. Today, the bulk of our investment is by way of external borrowing or external support through grants. To the extent that if you look at how that impact in our budget, almost 80% of our public sector investment is dependent on external finance. Now, to the extent that we can reorient the domestic resources allocation more into capital expenses, we will be less dependent on external borrowing. And by so doing, you are also controlling the debt growth. In terms of domestic borrowing, again, to the extent that a number of policy reforms are implemented within the wider civil service, including civil service reform, we should be able to reduce the recurrent expenditure and move a lot of resources into capital expenses, domestic capital investment. And therefore, if you do that also, you are narrowing the deficit and then also have less and less propensity to borrow from the domestic market. The debt problem have been tackled in two fronts, both at the domestic situation level, but also at the external level. You are already aware that after HIPIC, we are almost going into a second round of debt relief or debt restructuring, where we have engaged with the IMF as well as some external advisors to be able to support us, assess how much we need in terms of haircut that our bilateral donors must take to support the Gambia economic recovery process. But at the same time, we are not resting on our laurels. We are also doing something by way of civil service reform, by way of turning around our SOEs to be much more effective and functional. And instead of being a net today, a net dependent on the economy, but rather to become a net contributor to the economy, a net contributor to the budget.
Yeah. Let me, I have two follow-up questions, but one I would put to the Director of Budget and the second one I would put to you. To the Director of Budget, the PS just indicated that with the rebasing, new facts have surfaced, and one of the facts is that the economy is actually larger than what it was thought to be. Now, we have gone from budget in 2017 of 19.8 billion, I think, to now a 2019 budget of 25.3 billion, or thereabout. If indeed it has been found out that the economy is bigger than what we had thought all this while, due to the fact that we are now rebasing and we have now onboarded new realizations, then perhaps as Director of Budget, should we have been looking at a $30 billion budget instead of a $25 billion budget, especially where we've come to realize that the denominator, which is the GDP, because we are talking of domestic borrowing in terms of GDP, is actually bigger, and therefore the appetite would have been there in terms of borrowing. And I totally agree with him. Borrowing is not bad as long as you're borrowing and then the net result of that borrowing is a net creation of assets rather than causing liabilities, which has been previously. So as Director of Budget, have we been overly cautious, or could we have been a little bit more ambitious budget-wise?
Thank you. First, let me just quickly go back to your previous question with regards to our target in terms of tax policy moving forward. Because I omitted to mention one thing. If you look at the Ministry of Finance, our tax policies, in 2009, the biggest complaint was that corporate tax was too high in the Gambia. And at the time, it was about 35%. Likewise, the personal income tax, the highest bracket was about 30%. Likewise, at the time, we had a domestic sales tax rather than the VAT. But since 2009 to now, we've been gradually reducing, especially corporate tax. Now it has gone from 35% in 2009, now it's about 27%, which is the lowest in the region with the exception of Guinea-Bissau. Also, if you look at personal income tax, the highest bracket, because our personal income tax is progressive, meaning the more you earn, the more you are taxed. The highest bracket was 30%. Now the highest bracket is 25%. And also the tax-free threshold has also been increased from 18,000 per annum to 24,000 per annum. So if you make anything less than $24,000 per annum, you don't pay any taxes whatsoever. Now we still have some challenges with regards to tax policies. One of the key challenges is how do we harmonize central government and local government taxes, and that has been a big issue over the years. And we're working with GRA to see how best we can harmonize this taxation, because a lot of businesses are complaining that they're paying too many taxes, not only from central government, but also from local councils and local government as well.
That's the multiplicity of taxes.
Multiplicity of taxes, absolutely. Now, going back to your last question, are we cautious or optimistic with regards to our revenue projections for 2019? I think we were quite practical because we worked with the macro department team at the Ministry of Finance and also with the GRA to look at what is actually feasible and realistic. Coming from a base of 8.6 billion to 10.8 billion, that's more than 25% increment in just 1 year. Now, you made a very good point. In terms of the GDP has also increased. If you look at our tax revenue as a percentage of GDP, it has drastically reduced after we rebased the GDP. Now we are around, is it 11 or 12% of GDP? Whereas the region, normally best practice, international practice is minimum 20%. So yes, in that sense, you are right. We have a lot of room for improvement in terms of our tax revenue to GDP. But nevertheless, it must be on a gradual and phased approach. We try to implement reforms at the GRA to see how best they can improve the efficiency in terms of tax collection. But this will be on a medium-term basis. Maybe hopefully within the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, we can start looking at maybe 16, 17% tax revenue as a percentage of GDP. But this year, I think we are quite practical. We worked extensively with both our macro department team and also the GRA to come up with these tax revenue figures.
Yeah, but I mean, let me also even add a point there. If you look at the composition of GDP, basic economics, the percentage accounted for government. You know, we used to talk of that this country, the economy is dominated by government. But even if you look at that dominance, because of this rebasing as well, the composition of government's spending, you know, the G component, you know, if you go to basic economics, is, I mean, the formula is also, I mean, coming down as well. So perhaps an important thing for us to look at as well. I don't know whether you wanted to have a follow-up point before I come with my question. On the
yes, I mean, like he rightly puts, I mean, the relationship between revenue and GDP is quite interesting. It's not that the higher the GDP and therefore correspondingly the revenue is not one-to-one, because the contribution to GDP by sector, for example, agriculture and social sector, are not necessarily income generating sectors which are also translate to taxable income. But where, for example, the services sector such as telecom, we have to contribute increasingly higher, contributions increasingly to become higher, then you expect, your expectation naturally would be that then we should have also increased income. So, and his comparison that with the rebasing performing around 11% or 12% GDP per revenue is the lowest. But it's good to start at a modest level and then gradually grow towards the regional target of 21 or 20. It shows to us that yes, there are room for improvement, but also the jump that just have been registered from 2018 to 2019 to around 25% is already significant enough. We could have, you know, further stretch the elastic, but I think it's important that after so many considerations, other issues that came into play, we decided to limit it at this level to see how we then move from here.
Okay. Well, I mean, I agree, because if you look at the agricultural sector in terms of the percentage it contributes to GDP and the number of people who are in agriculture, because of the productivity in agriculture, productivity is so low, so you don't expect necessarily compared to the services sector. For, you know. But the follow-up question I wanted to put to you, Piers, is you mentioned, you made the point that, you know, within that rebasing and within that review, you know, some of the initiatives that you are taking, and one of which is civil service reform. I would have thought that the 50% increment in salary would have come when the civil service reform was completed. And let me say why I'm saying this. I know the issue of civil service, you could say, well, the civil service reform has started, or we have undertaken aspects of the civil service reform. But, you know, Economics 101, you know, tells us that, you know, salary increases should be based on something. You know, either people are more productive, you've ascertained, you know, their productivity level, and therefore you give an increase. But given an increase, a 50% increase across the board, without having undertaken a, you know, comprehensive civil service reform to see who should be kept and who should not be kept, who should be done away with, you know, in terms of trying to improve the machinery of government in terms of efficiency. But that has not been done, and there's a across the board 50% increase in salary. Do you foresee this to be a challenge in terms of implementing the various civil service reform that we have spoken about, have been speaking about, and yet we haven't had the willingness, if you will, you know, the willpower to actually implement it fully to the point where then perhaps that 50% increase could have happened because maybe you've gotten rid of people who are not efficient?
Ben, this is a very interesting debate. Civil service reform, pay, pension increase, which one should come first? Now, I think what in the Gambia we all generally agreed is that the civil service or the public servants, or civil servant in particular, are not well paid, or they are poorly paid, if I may put it that way. Now, if we are poorly paid, with little incentive to maintain and retain quality civil service for public service delivery, then there is a problem. Gambia is not only the least paid civil service. If you look at the wage bill as a percentage of total revenue compared to the region. But even with the 50% increase, unfortunately, I am here to report to you that we are still way, way, way too low compared to our peers. So now,
when you say peers, give me a country, for example. Senegal? Okay.
Senegal.
Okay.
I mean, if you look at the 4 billion he talks about, 4 billion of 18 billion, that gives you a percentage of what, Ben?
Well, 4 of 18.
No, in fact, it's
that's
more than that. It's 4 of 28 billion. That's about roughly 14.6%.
Yeah.
14.6%. I mean, in other jurisdictions, this number, PE as a percentage of revenue, would be as high as 25, 26.
But
so yes,
but
some people would say,
is the justification there? Is the productivity there? If you go to Senegal, I mean, you look at Senegal as an economy. You look at where Senegal is. I mean, Senegal could have been compared to Gambia. I mean, let's go back 5 or 10 years. The productivity in Senegal cannot be compared to the productivity in the Gambia. And that's the point I'm getting to.
I know.
Because salary should be based on something. It should be based on productivity.
Yeah, I mean, a salary, pay or reward should be based on what you also put in. It's just common sense. I'm sure a private entity or corporation would only pay more if you put in more.
Exactly.
So also the public entity, what we call the civil service. But I am saying, if we don't pay more, how do you then hire and retain the best? So it's the question of timing. Which one comes first? It's always like a chicken and egg. If you want to attract the best, you have to also at least put on the table something that is attractive. That's basically what I am saying. And indeed, civil service reform is a process, and it's also cut across a number of other things and other sectors. Civil service reform is not only about the HR policy of government in terms of attracting quality civil service, right-sizing the numbers, but also reforming our institution for public service delivery, security service reform. Generally, you know, reforms in the foreign service, reforms in the in agriculture, health, and everywhere will require this kind of reforms. Now, what we are saying is that there are so many things that we should do, or we are obliged to do at the same time. But at any given time, there is a limit of capacity of how much reform we can put on the table and then work towards implementing. So people are in a hurry, people are in a rush, but I think the 50% increase in terms of timing, for us, it is very important. If we must start with the basic, yes, people should not just rush on perception. There are out there some perception that says the civil service is overbloated. Based on what? Do we have assessed the kind of number that squarely is right for our public service delivery? Do we know the right quality, whether it exists in our public service to be able to deliver the aspiration of government to Gambians? Unless we do those things, we cannot just conclude that the number is wrong or the quality is not right. However, there's an element of truth to it that the productivity is this low because we need to do civil service reform. And like I said, the civil service reform cut across a number of other sectors that PMO is taking the lead in this process, but have to work with other sectors at the same time to be able to deliver on the civil service reform that we wish would have a minimal burden in terms of fiscal sustainability. But let me also touch quite briefly on what so many pundits have actually continued to argue, that the 50% increase is not sustainable. I don't know where they get their facts. I mean,
well, you could help enlighten them.
Yes, it's very, very interesting. And those who make those arguments should also, you know, in law, they said, if you allege the accuser, the burden of proof lies on the accuser to prove.
Yeah.
So they should have tell us that, yes, how do you finance? Show us how this is financed and whether this is sustainable or not.
Actually, it was going to be my next question to him, but
yeah. But I am saying in this 2019 budget, we have given you some guides. We have quite told you
where
very
the
simply
increases are going to come from.
where the increases are going to come from. And we not only stopped there, we even listed it for you. And that improvement alone, I mean, if you're talking about 2.8 billion was the existing bill. Today we're talking about 4.1. What is the net increase?
1.3.
Huh? 1.3
billion, yeah.
And the increment we're talking about is how much then, in terms of revenue and expenditure controls? And I am saying, gone are the days when, you know, people just should flag numbers without supporting them. I mean, we have put this on the table, and it's very clear. There's nothing to hide. We are saying, even if the increment that we have demonstrated and shown you were not there, mere movement of and prioritization of resources within the resource envelope should have been able to accommodate the net increase of 1.1 billion.
Maybe if let me play devil's advocate here and say that the budget, the 2019 budget, is quite explicit in terms of the various expenditure lines and the revenue streams. But as we all say, it's an estimate, and hence the reason why down the line it could be. You could go back to review it, or even where there are shortfalls, you could end up doing a supplementary. Submission of a bill. To Parliament. Perhaps maybe the sense of pessimism coming from the pundits who believe that the 50% may not be sustainable. I agree without looking at the numbers, because people like to talk without looking at the facts. You know, and I think as a country we need to begin to move away from that and argue based on facts. But maybe their thinking is the projections may not actualize. You know, because we spoke of taxes and the tax lines, you know, okay, you spoke of imports and how the increase in revenue is based on the expectations that imports are going to increase. The economy is going to be, buoyant. And then of course, you have the budgetary support that is coming from other areas in terms of capital expenditure, and that frees up, you know, some revenue streams that could now be targeted in other areas. Maybe that's their thinking without having seen the numbers. I don't know. I'm just being, devil's advocate here, but it's good that you're coming on the program and you're shedding light, on these things, you know, to make it clear for them to also understand that you are not just putting something there. You've crunched the numbers, you've looked at the possibilities, and you're saying it's doable, it's sustainable, and therefore let's go, for it. But let me do a follow-up question to you. I think you all know that this program, as you rightly said, is business and economy. And that being the case, I know you spoke of how we're expecting increases in tax revenues because the economy is going to be buoyant. And I know you spoke of the corporate tax rate and how that has come down over time, and because of that, perhaps that is where the expected buoyancy is coming from. But notwithstanding, you know, corporate businesses, the private sector, still wants to see more reduction in taxes. That is their interest. This is the things that you hear about all the time. You know, taxes are high in this economy and stuff. When I looked at the budget and I saw that the revenue projections, you know, and I've gone through it, and optimistically, they're sound, you know, but the private man will still tell you taxes are high and we want taxes reduced. But let me touch also on another point. In terms of fiscal consolidation, we know that the policy rate of the central bank, the rediscount rate, has come down. But we are not seeing that being reflected in terms of the commercial banks lending. Yeah, and for me personally, I think that at this time, when government has taken the decision that it is going to help to fiscally consolidate yeah, and tighten its appetite for domestic borrowing, and in that way decided to reduce the treasury bill rates. One would have thought that the bank's lending rate would also have followed suit, so that that in itself would enhance the very buoyancy that you talk about from the private sector. But we are not seeing a commensurate reduction in interest rates from the banks. I mean, why do you think that is? I mean, to the both of you, if anyone wants to jump in.
Yeah, let me just give a few signals, and then Bai can elaborate more on this. In economy, we say the interest rate never lie. All right, it usually it's a true reflection of the state of the economy or the performance of the economy. Now, in a situation where you have a very good standing in terms of monetary policy and monetary policy performance, and the fiscal side of the economy is also doing quite well, the expectation is that you would see the interest rate coming down, starting with the policy rate, but also the lending rate. But I think when businesses complain about high lending rate, is maybe being compared to other jurisdictions. But if you just compare 2 years ago, 3 years ago, where the lending rates were at 25, 27, compared to the lending rate towards 15% or 14%.
Are those the lending rates currently?
The current lending rates.
I mean, at the commercial banks?
It's slightly more than that. It's
Yeah.
19, 20%.
Yeah, but the point I'm making is that it's significantly coming down. It's significantly coming down. So and it's just mirroring the reduction in the policy rate. The policy rate gives a signal to the banks as to what the perception of the authorities, the monetary authorities as well as the fiscal authorities, in terms of the appetite for borrowing, and to tell them that, well, you have a choice to make between, locking in the T-bills or finding an alternative to invest your funds elsewhere. And that's the comparison that you usually make. The point I'm making is that actually the lending rates are coming down. This is the truth. Maybe on that, if you want to add.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. If you look at the Ministry of Finance, our fiscal policy, it has been quite expansionary for a very long time, meaning that we've been spending more than we actually generating revenues. And this has posed a problem for us because most of this deficit is being financed through the domestic market by issuing treasury bills and the like. And if you look at previously, we were borrowing so much from the domestic market. In 2016 alone, the net domestic borrowing was about $4 billion, and most of that was borrowed from the domestic market. And because of that, the banks were requesting for higher interest on these treasury bills. And also the banks were mainly investing in T-bills rather than giving out loans to the private sector. So in effect, government was crowding out the private sector.
Yeah.
But look at last year, what happened last year. I think last year what happened is quite important. For the first time last year, our NDB was less than 1% of GDP. All because of government's fiscal consolidation efforts. We borrowed very minimal amount of money last year through the issuance of treasury bills. And as a result, what happened? Like my peers said, first, the treasury bills interest rate drastically went down. Today is about, is it 6, 7, 8, 9% or something like that compared to before. And what that did was it forced banks to now also start looking into the private sector. And if you look at the monetary reports being produced by the central bank, for the first time in a very long time, credit to the private sector has actually increased by about 20% for the first time in a very long time. And this is really quite, a laudable achievement. And the key thing now is how to sustain it. As my peer said, yes, the borrowing rates are still quite high. We want to see it at least around 12, 14, 15%. But look at where it's coming from. 2 years ago, about 27. For a private man going to the bank and borrowing at 27%, 28%, it is really quite difficult to make profit and pay your taxes and also pay your interest and all. It's very difficult as a private sector guy. But now these rates are gradually reducing from 27 to 25 to 23. Now it's roughly around 19, 20, 21%, which is still quite a laudable achievement. But we still have a long way to go.
Well, my argument was, I think government has done its bit. the crowding out effect complaint that used to be leveled against government when government decided to reduce its policy rate, the central bank, you know, therefore meaning that private businesses or even banks can no longer park money where it's going to earn you little. So you are compelled to look in the private sector and now try to provide financing to bankable private sector projects. But one would have thought 20% is laudable, I totally agree, but I would have thought that it would have been more than that. You know, but perhaps, I mean, I should invite the banks to, tell me why that is not, the case. But moving on.
If you don't mind, just to clarify that, one desirable situation with respect to the lending direction is also now to move from government to the private sector, but also within the private sector to move from services and trading related to also the real sector. This is one aspect we also wish to see happen with this change in policy. But one aspect also that you touched, Ben, which is also quite important, was that as it relates to or contribute to cost of doing business in this country, like your program, we need to assure the private sector that fiscal consolidation definitely is going to reduce tax rates and bring down overall cost of production, overall cost of doing business in this country. And therefore, those rates would begin to see reduction.
Okay.
And we have not, in fact, increased in 2019 corporate income tax. We left it unchanged. So the direction for government is that we will continue to see these rates reduced. At some point, we can temporarily halt until situation improves when you decide to lower a bit. But that's the situation. We don't think in any foreseeable time that this will come up.
Perhaps the last thing that we would discuss in this program, and this has very important relation to the fiscal balance that we are talking about. You spoke of the real sector. If you look at the budget breakdown, it's broken down in terms of budgetary allocations. It talks about the real sector, the social services, sector as well. I want to look at the real sector. And here I'm going to use my former ministry as an example, and also trade. If you look at the budgetary allocation to foreign affairs, it is well in excess of the budgetary allocation to the Ministry of Trade.
Yes.
Now, the question I want to ask is, why aren't we as a country spending more money on the real sector, providing more budgetary allocation to the real sectors of the economy, the respective ministries and institutions, compared to, say, for example, the social services sector, excluding education and health, because I think those two are important.
I'm happy that you are making that recognition. Ministry of Finance, to tell you the truth, don't even have discretion or blanket discretion in the way we allocate resources. It's a process. The process starts with consultation at the grassroots level, gauging people perception and people aspiration, which are then translated into plan. One such plan is National Development Plan. So we would allocate budgetary resources based on what the plan priorities are. And beside that also, once you allocate as much as possible aligned to that plan, the final say also lies with the National Assembly. Now, two things happen in this economy is that what the budget demonstrates is just a significant amount of resources, but not the total resources. To the sector that you just talked about, tourism. The tourism as a ministry, which is just is managing the policy. But if you look at tourism programs, is handled by the GT board. The GT board resources is not integrated into this particular budget. And those are the ones doing the investments. So with respect to the allocation to the ministry, the expectation or the understanding is that we are allocating those resources for policy management, all right? And a bigger chunk of resources is handled and managed elsewhere. And this is the case in so many other sectors. That's why you have SOEs. The SOEs ideally, maybe with time, will begin to be able, we will be in a situation and a position to integrate SOE budget to be able to determine total investment in this economy. But what we see in the budget is just a portion of public sector investment, but it's not the total public sector investment that is being captured. This is the reality. The other aspect is that we talk about also size. Ministry of Foreign Affairs is a big ministry compared to the Ministry of Trade or the Ministry of Tourism. Size matters.
Yeah, size matters, but the point I'm trying to make is, what is foreign affairs bringing to the coffers of government, yeah, compared to what the trade ministry could bring to the coffers of government? That's where I'm talking from.
Yeah.
So I'm talking of, I give you so much, but what are you giving me back? Because, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, let me just take this to basic departmental budgeting. If I give the Department of Marketing 10 million, I expect Department of Marketing to give me in terms of revenue way more than 10 million. So you know, this is the point I'm trying to make.
Yes.
I mean, that's the angle I'm looking at it from. Foreign affairs is getting so much in terms of allocation, but what is it giving back to government?
The foreign, I understand your point, but let's start by saying that foreign policy implementation is not cheap business. But we use our station, our foreign missions, in terms of networking with our partners. Today, we are coordinating very closely with these foreign missions to be able to translate our pledges, the NDB pledges, into commitment and to delivery of programs. We cannot be everywhere. So these are important hot network points that we use as part of our service delivery.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, the time has run out, and on this program, we endeavor to respect time. I think we'll have to do a follow-up program to this one. But viewers, thank you very much for joining us. It has been an insightful discussion from both the Permanent Secretary, Mr. Mort Sise, and the Director of Budget, Mr. Baimadi Sise. Thanks for coming on the program. As usual, you can follow us online, Q TV, and also Q Radio. And we are in Christmas. To all of our viewers, compliments of the season, a Merry Christmas to you, and a happy and prosperous New Year in advance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, gis nga, xam nga every time I wax loo ak yéen yaa ngi taxaw fi nga ne ma 10 minutes. Within